Welcome to Amphibian and Reptile Conservation's podcast series. For this podcast, the topic is adder bite, and I've got to be honest, it feels a bit negative to record a commentary through this really quite narrow lens about one of Britain's most beautiful and fascinating vertebrates. But then again, perhaps that's the best way to reassure anybody worried about adders by looking at the facts, understanding the mechanics of an adder bite, the effects and the risks. Now, I hope that some of you will be listening to this because you don't know much about adders and you want to know more. And if you're in that category, great, because you are the person I had in mind in the recording of this podcast. So let's start by considering the snake itself. Firstly, the adder, or northern viper, Vipera berus, is a small snake. Now, I'm lucky enough to have shown adders in the wild to people who've never seen them before. And the typical response when they see one is, "Oh wow, so how big do the adults get?" Well, you're looking at an adult, and any adder that's even close to 60 centimetres or 2 foot long is big for the species, and the adult males in particular are often smaller than that. They're quite stocky, so they're not really long, thin snakes. And what do they look like? Well, as ever, go to the reptiles and amphibians section of our website at arc-trust.org to see the pictures and the videos. But for now, the key identification feature is a dark and obvious zigzag line right down the centre of the back, and that's black in males, it's brown in females. And the other thing to consider is that you do find all black adders, so adders that are uniform black in colour. So if you find a black snake, then it's safe to assume that it's an adder. So being able to identify an adder is a good start, but it's also just as important to understand how they behave. And like most snakes, they're very shy, and that means two things. Firstly, they like to stay in relatively deep cover, so deep in the vegetation. And secondly, they're alert, and they'll disappear very quickly if they see or hear anything that disturbs them, like a passing human. So 9 times out of 10, they will hear you before you hear them, and they'll get out of your way without you even knowing it, quite frankly. But what about the other 1 in 10 times? Now, staying deep in the vegetation is their preference, but they are cold-blooded, so they need to heat up in the sun, especially in the early spring. And bear in mind they come out of hibernation in February. And generally, to do that, they find a sunny spot deep in the vegetation, but sometimes they will sit in the sun on the edges of paths. And female adders also sometimes do this in summer because they've got developing young inside them and they want to incubate. Secondly, when they're looking for mates in the spring, and sometimes in the summer when they're out looking for food, they can be a bit distracted, and they might take slightly less notice of people and dogs, which means that they might cross your path. So again, when they're distracted like that, you are slightly more likely to come across them. And the other thing to consider is that from time to time they shed their skin, and in the lead up to this, their eyes go cloudy, as the lens, which covers the eye, is actually part of the skin, and the cloudiness is the fluid building up underneath that skin to separate the old skin on the outside from the new skin underneath. And what this means is that for a couple of days before they shed their skin, they effectively lose one of their senses, so they may not be able to see you, and in which case they might not disappear as quickly as they otherwise would. The other perspective that we have to consider is that the adder is by no means a common animal. And it's a species in the UK that's getting rapidly less common, sadly. Now, populations of adders are always local, and they tend to be focused on open habitats like commons and heaths and moorland. Open woods are quite good, and hedgerows, and also sea cliffs. But they don't often come into gardens, so you're more likely to encounter them in the wider countryside. Now, we could do a whole podcast on the status of the adder, but that's not our topic today. Every adder in the UK is legally protected, and every one is precious. And all the indications are that this is a species heading for the brink. It's not quite at the brink yet, but it's not far off. So let's get to the meat of the topic. Of the 3 native species of snake that we have in the UK, the adder is the only one that uses a venomous bite to subdue its prey, and normally they eat small mammals or nestling birds, and they subdue them with the venom before swallowing them whole. So its venom is precious, so it only wants to use it on prey items, but if it's pushed, it will use it defensively. Now let's consider the mechanism for delivering that venom. The glands that produce it are deep in the adder's head, and they're connected to needle-sharp hypodermic syringe-like fangs. Now these fangs aren't big, they're perhaps about 5 millimeters long, 5 millimeters at best, and they hinge down from the roof of the mouth when they come into use. And the venom is injected by a coiled snake uncoiling rapidly and striking forward in a stabbing motion. And the reach of that strike is frankly no more than about 150 centimetres or 6 inches. So you've got to be properly close to an adder to get bitten. Now here's the important point. To inject venom, an adder does not have to bite down on its prey to inject the venom. It injects it by stabbing. Now, if you compare an adder's mouth with a human mouth, the joint at the corner of a human mouth is a proper hinge, and it can only open, let's say, 30 degrees. A snake's mouth, the joint is not a hinge, so the bones are connected by very elastic material so that it can open its mouth to 180 degrees, so that the upper jaw and the lower jaw are flat, they're in the same plane. And when it strikes, with its mouth open flat, those stabby little fangs are pointing straight out from the roof of the mouth. Now, why is that important? Because it means that if you find a tiny, tiny baby adder, no more than the size of a pencil, don't think it can't bite you, because it can. It can successfully inject venom into you. And that quick injection of venom happens so fast you'd barely see it. And what it'll do is leave 2 tiny pinpricks behind that are no more than 1 centimetre apart. So what's in the venom? Snake venom is a proper cocktail of peptides and proteins that induce inflammatory responses and neurotoxic responses. And the venomous snakes in the viper family, like the adder, contain more poisons that affect the vascular system and fewer that affect the nervous system. This means that it has a strong inflammatory response and could cause the tiny blood vessels, your capillaries, to leak blood into surrounding tissues, and it can also affect heart function. And just like bee and wasp stings, it can in some people also induce anaphylaxis. So now it's time to speak to somebody who has been bitten. So here's an interview I recorded earlier, and this interview is with Gary. And Gary speaks about tins. Now, some of you will know what that means, but for those of you that don't, one of the ways that we monitor snake populations is to leave out small sheets of corrugated iron, the stuff that's used for roofing on an agricultural building. And the snakes use these as refuges because they like to get underneath them to warm up. So here's the interview I recorded with Gary earlier. I'm joined by Gary Powell, who's Amphibian and Reptile Conservation's Senior Reserves Manager. Gary, we're going to have a conversation about adder bite. First of all, I just wanted to ask you about the circumstances of when you were bitten by an adder.
Sure. Unfortunately, it was twice. The first time was in, I think, 2005. And I was just out wardening on sites at the time, and it appeared to be a really good day for snakes. Lifted a tin, as we always do, and suddenly noticed, I didn't even see it happen, just felt something really sharp, saw 2 pinpricks of blood on my finger. And it was so quick, I thought, well, I must have just cut myself on the tin, and then looked down and saw a female and a male adder curled up under the tin, but right at the edge, whereas normally we sort of, for some reason, assume they'll be in the middle.
And what was the effect of that bite?
That one, I mean, the effects are very quick. There's a sort of a real stinging sensation. Swelling starts quite rapidly, squashing the adders while realising you've been bitten. Then getting back to the car, the main effect over the next couple of days was swelling, and that was huge. It started I was bitten on the finger. It started in the hand, and the hand swelled up to the size of a sort of a big American baseball glove. I mean, really, really big. And then that gradually travelled up my arm, and eventually, I suppose 24 hours, 12 hours later, 18 hours later, stopped on my shoulder. So it went as far as that.
And that was painful, presumably.
Yeah. I mean, the initial bite, not that painful. The stinging starts very quickly, as I said. And then the swelling is so you just sort of wonder if your arm's going to burst, how big an arm can swell. And that was uncomfortable, I think it's fair to say, yeah.
And that was, the swelling was, did that go black?
No, it was a bit sort of reddish, but there was no real discoloration. It was just the size of it, and it moved fairly rapidly up the arm after the initial thing. The second time, bizarrely enough, was on a guided walk. Again, we lifted a tin. There was an adder which behaved really well. I lifted the tin, just held the tin up. People took some photos. The adder was very calm, and as it moved off, it appeared to get stuck in the heather at the side of the tin and was sort of jerking backwards and forwards. And this was a good while after the first bite, so by then I was armed with a snake hook, which I'd used abroad as well. And this, again, I couldn't put the tin down. The adder appeared to be sort of stuck there, so I was using the snake hook to sort of manipulate it out of the heather. Completely misjudged where its head was, and its head was obviously curled back on itself, which was again very close to my finger. So I got bitten again on the same finger, I believe.
And was the effect of that the same?
It was a little bit less severe this time.
Okay.
I've got no idea why. Yeah, it wasn't quite as bad as the first one, and the swelling travelled a bit more slowly up my arm, but it did do the same thing.
Did it make you feel sick? Because people do report feeling sick.
No, I felt fine throughout, actually. I didn't feel unwell at all. The only throughout both of them, the only bad experience as far as feeling ill was when they give you adrenaline, which does the total opposite of what people imagine adrenaline does. It's sort of like a great big slump. It's a horrible feeling.
Okay, well let's move on to that. So you got some treatment, obviously, if you were given adrenaline. So just talk us through the treatment that you got.
Yeah, so the first time I had to walk back to the car, so I made a phone call, got a colleague to drive me to the hospital, took off any jewellery, watches, rings, and then when I got to the hospital, and I kept the hand very still. It turned into chaos because there was a massive panic when I went in. They weren't sure about snakes in this country. They wouldn't take my word for it of what it was, and in fact, they decided I'd broken my finger. So then they took me for an X-ray and sort of moved my hand around into various positions while I was trying to tell them I really needed to keep it still. And it took quite a while before they accepted what I'd said, as you know, it was an adder bite. And that was the worst part of it, is that I was fairly calm about it, but the people in the hospital went into a bit of a panic.
So what treatment did they give you when they accepted the fact that it was an adder bite?
That time I didn't have antivenom. As we all have, I've read about antivenom and the fact that it does sometimes cause problems for people. I've got a severe nut allergy, so I wasn't sure whether antivenom would be safe for me. So I refused the antivenom, which they weren't particularly happy about. It took them a while to get it, and by then the swelling had gone quite a long way up my arm. But in the end, I had to agree that if it went beyond my shoulder, if the swelling continued and went systemic, I would need to have the antivenom because it was getting a bit serious. But it actually stopped. The swelling stopped at my shoulder. Second time, in between the two adder bites, I'd been working in Central America and done a lot more investigation into the risks of antivenom, and had been assured that the one allergy that I have for nuts that had no bearing on the chances of me being affected adversely by antivenom. So I had the antivenom treatment the second time. That did slow it and reverse it a lot more rapidly than just letting it happen, obviously. And I had no ill effects at all from the antivenom.
But did you have adrenaline that time? Because you mentioned that earlier on.
I definitely did the first time because that was the most, as I say, the most unpleasant part of it. I think I did the second time, but I'm not entirely sure. But yeah, and that was just to stop the sort of swelling, the allergic reaction. So yeah, but that's a really unpleasant part of it, unfortunately.
Okay. And how long did the effect last? I mean, how long did it take you to recover?
I think the first time I was in hospital for 3 days. The second time, probably only a day and a half, 2 days. But they weren't prepared to let me out until the swelling had really gone down. And that took a bit of a time. And after that, obviously, you have antibiotics, which again isn't a pleasant part of it.
So look, we always advise when we're out monitoring for snakes, and particularly when we're turning over refuges, to use a stick to turn over a refuge. I guess you're following that advice these days.
Yeah, I'm a firm advocate of that these days. And even at the first, when I was first bitten, I probably did most of the time. But as I say, we always, for some naive reason, assumed the snake could be sat nicely in the middle rather than right at the edge where your finger is. So I got caught out. But yeah, I haven't made that mistake since, and I use a snake hook now if I'm lifting tins. So yeah, that's a definite. You really do have to do that.
Okay, so that's one piece of learning. Any other learning or advice that you would give to those out there that might come across snakes, might come across adders, or those that are deliberately out looking for them?
Yeah, I mean, in both my bites, the fault was mine. The misjudgment was mine. It is, if I hadn't been close to the adders, then nothing would have happened. There's no aggression there whatsoever. And if people come across adders in the wild, then observing them is totally safe. If you're taking photographs or just watching them, then there's absolutely no danger to that. There's very little reason to pick adders up. And even in a professional capacity, I don't pick adders up unless I need to. So I've had to take them out of schools, had to take them out of hospital waiting rooms. But other than that, there's really no need to just pick snakes up. They don't appreciate it, and for obvious reasons. And that's when the danger comes in. But other than that, it should be a safe procedure, finding and observing an adder. I think the major thing is to try and remain calm, which is easier said than done. Obviously, for me, it was a lot easier because I knew what it was. I knew the sort of statistics behind it. I knew the chances of me being seriously ill were fairly slim. And it was sort of quite interesting, I suppose, bizarrely, to watch this develop. If you're not familiar with wildlife or snakes and you get bitten, then obviously it's not very easy to be calm about it. And again, in the two hospital scenarios, the first one, there was total chaos and panic, and that wouldn't have been good if I wasn't sure what was going on. The second time, it was very, very practical and pragmatic. They just said, fine, get in the queue behind the rugby injuries and just wait. And that was probably, if you're not sure what's going on, that's quite a good thing because no one was panicking. And I think the obvious one is, don't remove jewellery, because if the swelling does kick in, then you really don't want that issue as well. You do hear various things about, I've seen one talking about capturing the snake and taking it in, but that's a definite no. You don't want to do that. You don't need to take a photo of it, really. My issue was getting the snake safe because I had a piece of metal above it, so that was a bit of a tricky one. But most people probably wouldn't be doing that.
Yeah, that's true. Brilliant, thank you, Gary. That's gives us some real insights into both the effect and the treatment. But and it underlines the whole point of avoiding getting bitten in the first place, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there should be no need for this to happen. Mine happened in a work capacity, but for most people that shouldn't arise. So you should be safe around adders.
Great, thank you very much, Gary.
Brilliant. Cheers, Howard. Thank you.
Now we come to an even more difficult topic. You've had Gary's sanguine view of being bitten and his confidence that he would survive. Now we're going to consider the risk of fatalities. And here I also want to mention dogs, as they are probably more at risk due to the fact that they explore the world with an easily bitten part of their anatomy, their nose. The effect of adder bite on dogs is very similar to humans, and more dogs than humans get bitten. And for smaller and older dogs, it is more serious. Most dogs do survive, and the key is to get treatment quickly and, like Gary, remain calm. Because dogs are highly likely to be away from their owners when they sustain an injury, adders can unfortunately get blamed if an undiagnosed injury occurs which results in similar symptoms. Now, there are some obvious mitigation, keeping dogs on leads, particularly in nature reserves where adders are present, and secondarily training. Now, the two family dogs that we've owned both spent every waking moment out in adder country and accompanied me on many reptile hunting trips. But they had enough basic training to obey commands like heel to stay behind me, sit and stay to hold them in place, and leave to curb their interest in something that had attracted their attention. And despite that level of exposure, there was only one occasion after a nighttime summer walk when I suspected that one of them was bitten by an adder, because adders can be active at night as well. And the symptoms were quite trivial, and the dog recovered quite quickly. But let's move on now to consider human fatalities. And to discuss that, here's another interview that I recorded earlier. So, Steve, I'm talking to Steve Langham. Steve is the chair of the Surrey Amphibian and Reptile Group. Normally, Steve would be walking one of our favourite sites because we're lucky to live in an area that still has adder populations. And I know, you know, from speaking to you that we as adder fans, if you like, we kind of downplay the risk of being bitten, and we certainly downplay the risk of it being fatal. And a lot of us quote fatality risk in terms of, you know, you're more likely to be killed by being struck by lightning or bee and wasp stings and things of that nature. And when pressed, I usually state that there's around 10 people that have been killed by adders in the last 100 years. And I know that that's something that intrigued you, and you decided to do something about it.
Yeah, it wasn't quite that way round. It was more that there's sort of in the adder world, if you like, there's this received knowledge that there's been 9 or 10 or 14 deaths in the last 100 years, and it's sort of in everyone's psyche. Everyone's sort of aware of that sort of number. And I happened to be doing some research on a completely different topic, which meant I was trawling through a lot of old newspaper articles, and I took a bit of a break from that and did a search on adders, and an adder fatality came up. And it was new to me, and I just didn't recognise it. Now, I couldn't have listed all 14 adder deaths over the last 100 years, but I certainly have read them. All the information about this was completely new to me. So that led me to thinking, where did this 14 number come from? It all comes from an article written in the British Medical Journal in 1976 by Hugh Alistair Reid, who's quite an eminent toxicologist, did a lot of work on snakebite in the Southeast Asia. And he wrote a paper on adder bite. He kind of did a survey. So he talked to a lot of doctors, and he referenced a lot of previous BMJ articles. And he came up with this figure of 14 deaths in the last 100 years. So that's where it stems from. That's where it comes from. This newspaper article I came across wasn't on his list. So that then leads you to think, well, if that's not on the list, one, is it real? Is it have the newspapers got it wrong? And secondly, if it is true, how many others aren't recognised or listed? So having done quite a lot of genealogical research, family history stuff in the past anyway, I had enough information to look up the person, and they existed, and the deaths correlated at the right time. And eventually I managed to find a coroner's report as well.
Okay.
It was a genuine article. You know, it was the newspaper article was corroborated. So that led me to think, well, hang on a minute. It's 15, not 14. Is it any more? Started digging, and I spent a cold winter, I think 2018, just pouring through newspaper results, old newspaper reports. And I quite like doing that sort of researchy stuff anyway. And when it's a subject that you're interested in, it's a no burden. And yeah, came up with, I think, a list of 55 adder fatalities, which was a lot more than 14, albeit more than a century.
That's a lot more than 14. But how far did you go back, Steve?
As far as there were newspapers, really. So what you find is the further back you go, the more scant the details are. And that's partly because the sort of 18th century journalistic style was very cursory. And as you get more into Victorian times, they become more detailed and more sort of recognised as professional journalism. But the earliest one I've got here is 1722. So it's really from the 18th century onwards. And broadly, there's about 14 fatalities listed in the 1700s, about 35 in the 1800s. Another sort of 18 or so in the 1800s, and maybe 20 in the 20th century, the 1900s. So it was a lot more than if you like, the group of people who were familiar with adders and the ecology and history around them. It was a surprise. So I thought I would document this. So wrote up the short paper, which basically collated all the newspaper reports and did a little bit of assessment on those reports to dig out some facts, because we've got to be cognizant that, each one of these is is a human tragedy.
Yes.
And although I didn't have any misgivings really about the 18th and 19th century stuff, when you got to 20th century stuff, we're getting into living history.
Yeah.
Even though we've not had a death since 1975, a tragic death of a 5-year-old in Scotland, I paused and sucked my teeth for a bit and said, is this something we should document? And the sort of conclusion I came to was, I'm really only listing what was in newspapers at the time. This isn't going to be a bestseller. I'm not going to cause heartbreak or discomfort, I think, to the family. And if we can get something useful out of the statistics, then it's not just a pointless death. Maybe it can reduce the risk of fatalities in the future. So for those reasons, I thought it was probably worth going ahead and making it a comprehensive list. But there's an ethical side to it you do have to consider.
Yes, of course, and I've read the report, and I must admit, like you, I was concerned about the fact that each one of those stories is about somebody losing their life, but they are fascinating stories nevertheless. And I must admit, certainly with some of the older ones, I was struck by the number of accounts where adders were caught and stuck in somebody's pocket and taken into a drinking establishment, and some of those unfortunate incidents came about as a result of a bit of bravado going on. So give me some of the other accounts that struck you.
Well, of course, we still get the bravado these days. I mean, there was the famous case in Scotland where a guy took his family picnicking and he saw an adder in the bushes, and his first thought was to pick it up. And then he saw another one and he picked it up with the other hand, and then he got bitten in both wrists simultaneously. He survived. He was fine. And that's what really came out of looking at the figures and the numbers, was that you have got to be very unlucky to die from an adder bite. And 40% of those 55 deaths were of children aged under 10 years old. So it's the very young who are susceptible. Adults generally survive adder bites without any problem at all. Some of the other issues we've had is that the antivenom that was used in the sort of 50s and 60s, the Pasteur antivenom, that was known to, in some cases, promote anaphylaxis, sort of an allergic reaction. And unfortunately, one fatality, I think he was a teenager in Dorset, was doing actually quite well after the adder bite until he was given the antivenom, and that almost killed him immediately. Now, we don't use that antivenom anymore. There's the VNO antivenom is very different. That was a particularly tragic case, really. So, but you mentioned alcohol, and another interesting sort of conclusion that came out was, I don't think alcohol makes you more likely to encounter adders. Now, these people who do pick them up and put them in their pockets. Now, you and I have both tried to catch adders in the past because of research used for educational value. They're not easy things to catch. There's normally good cover around. That cover's pretty spiky. They're very shy animals. They can shoot off at a moment's notice, and then you got to catch one without annoying it enough to get bitten. And they are quite docile animals. There are accounts of children catching adders and taking them to a pet shop to try to sell them, and the guy behind the counter horrified that this child's holding an adder that's wrapped around his arm, and the adder hasn't bitten them. So they can be quite docile. But it's, you're rolling dice and it's not good odds in your favour. You wouldn't want to pick one up. So leave well alone. Somewhere between a quarter and a third of all the fatalities, people have gone looking for trouble. They've deliberately interacted with the snake. They've picked it up, they've poked it, they've prodded it, they've basically not left the snake alone. So with that simple rule, if you see an adder, leave it alone, treat it with respect, you'd instantly lose maybe a third of the fatalities. They just wouldn't have happened. So maybe alcohol will make you a little bit braver with interacting with a snake. But what does seem to happen is the people who've been bitten when they've been well under the influence seem to be more likely to die. Several people died who were apparently healthy adults, but they'd had a skinful. I mean, it's not scientific, and I'm not a medical doctor, so it would need more research. But there's the suggestion of a hypothesis that high levels of alcohol in the blood together with being bitten by an adder isn't a good combination.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think the other thing that you mentioned is some of the places are interesting, aren't they? Because some of the places in those reports are places we still know that adders exist today.
Yeah, and the majority, that's in the cases, that's true. One of the other things we do is we look for historic records of where adders are, so we can look at what the previous distribution was, and that helps with understanding the modern ecology and distribution for the snakes. And in most cases, I'd say, and in nearly 80% of the cases, adders are still present in these locations. But notably, some areas, they're just not there anymore. So most of the London locations, adders are no longer present. And we believe adders aren't present in a hotspot in Shropshire where 3 deaths occurred in the same woodland. We don't think there are adders there anymore. But I wouldn't say the survey's been so extensive that we could absolutely rule them out. But this sort of historical research is quite good for looking at, the historic range of the animals.
Yeah, that's important. So, Steve, if people want to read the paper, where can they get to see it?
Well, it is on the Surrey Amphibian Group website. Under the information tab, there's guides and publications, and you should be able to quite easily navigate to that and click on a literature review of fatalities attributed to the adder in Great Britain. A little bit of a mouthful, but that is exactly what it is. It's a literature review. There's some wraparound and contextual information there. For me, the interest really was reading these historic accounts because it's good social history, and it gives you an insight not only just to adder fatalities, but also life in the 17th and 18th centuries. There's all sort of incidental details that come out, like how long it was to walk to your job as a bricklayer, and you're walking backwards and forwards across the heath every day, and you stop off for a few beers to make the walk seem a little bit less of a problem, and you come across an adder, and one poor Welsh chap decided to investigate this adder by trying to kill it with a penknife. Certainly, as you go, and he got bitten, and he died from it eventually. But you do find that as you go further back in time, people were much keener to kill on sight adders. And then as you get more and more towards the modern day, there seems to be a little bit more respect for the animal and to leave it alone, which is a nice thing.
That's a good thing, and that's a good note to end on. Is it's nice to see these things, but they demand our respect, and they're always best left alone. Absolutely,
and an awful lot of fatalities would have been avoided with that approach.
Excellent, thanks, Steve.
You're more than welcome.
So there we are. I hope that this podcast has helped you to understand more about adder bites. And it's really important to sign off by asking that we all respect adders, give them space, and really do not even think about handling them. No wild snake should ever be handled unless absolutely necessary. And remember that adders are beautiful, so by all means enjoy them from a distance, and remember that they are shy, they're non-aggressive, they're nervous creatures. And that we should not only respect them, but we should also continue to do all that we can to ensure that they remain a fascinating and an exciting part of Britain's wildlife. So look out for more interesting stories about Britain's reptiles and amphibians in Amphibian and Reptile Conservation's podcast series. Thank you for listening.